trying to remember all my notes in my head. Sounds good. We're trying to be really careful too. It's tricky being an essential organization.
I search the sky for something amazing. Remind me there's
yeah, they are, unfortunately. I've had one employee get sick earlier in the year.
Still miraculous. I see you in the ordinary.
You know, we've had some clients
Every breath
got sick,
I breathe.
but by and large,
Own heartbeat.
those who
I know you're
helped us
always
be careful,
right
helped us
here
keep our
with
own
me.
numbers down as an organization.
Nothing is mundane. Your glory is displayed in a million ways. In the ordinary,
Right.
you make my
Yeah.
days.
Both my parents are public school teachers, and one of
In
them
the
is
ordinary.
in office right now, and the other one is not. It's
In
at
the
home.
sun.
So it's really coming down to how each school district handles it.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is William Nickran, and I have the privilege of serving as a pastor here at Pittsboro United Methodist Church. And I know this isn't the normal way that we meet and we get information out to our community, but we are still thankful for this technology and the way that we can meet with you right in your home, as you're traveling, wherever you are, hopefully not driving. But this is some incredible information about mental health and ways that we can take care of ourselves and others. We are in a time where mental health, taking care of ourselves and others needs to be a huge priority. So it is my privilege to introduce to you today Chase Cotten, the Executive Director of the Willow Center. He is taking time out of his schedule to be here because he knows the importance of this information, and we want to get it out to our community. So Chase, thank you so much for being here. And just as a reminder, at 7:45, he will be taking Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in the comment section right now. We will get to them at 7:45. We'll announce it a few other times, but 7:45 Q&A. So Chase, thanks for being here, man.
Thank you so much, Pastor. Really appreciate that. Hello, everybody who is tuning in. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for making the time, really, in your midweek schedules to listen to some information that I think is going to be really valuable for you, both as a church community as well as the greater Pittsboro and Central Indiana community. So really briefly, I just wanted to introduce you all to the Willow Center. Make sure my clicker is on here. Looks like we lost our clicker again. There we go. All right. So some of the services that the Willow Center provides are listed here on this slide, including extended substance use treatment, mental health counseling and therapy, family and relationship counseling. We have restorative justice programs in partnership with Hendricks County Probation and Work Release, wellness and mindfulness practices, aftercare and recovery management, prevention education, and a variety of specialty groups. And the Willow Center is located literally up the road, just right up 136 here, about 4 miles away. is where our office is, on the corner of Green Street and 56th, right sort of where the old cemetery is. We're located in that building, so you can't miss us. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we do before we dive into our main topic. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably feeling very stressed right now. We've never been in a pandemic before. This is new for all of us. And many of us probably feel the weight of what I've coined the term ambient anxiety. There's this ambient anxiety in the air with loved ones getting sick, colleagues getting sick. Maybe, God forbid, some of us have lost loved ones to this disease, as well as just the added stress of whatever economic burdens you and your family might be facing, whether that's the loss of income or whether that's the loss of even just the security of what potential income you have right now. All of this stress almost enters the air we breathe. And believe it or not, this really affects how we think and how we feel and how we relate to one another. So mental health and mental wellness and mental illness, these things are more relevant than they ever have been before. And maybe you're a little bit uncomfortable with those terms. That's okay. If you feel a little uncomfortable with it now, let me be the first to tell you that we're going to talk about a few things tonight that might make you feel a little uneasy at first. But I'm going to ask for your permission. Just bear with me. We're going to walk through it together. I'm not going to leave you hanging. And if you have any questions about some of the more difficult or taboo subjects that we're going to cover, by all means, enter those in the chat box, and I'll try and answer those at 7:45. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start by talking about what even is mental health. I think the best way to describe it is it's the thing behind all the other things. Mental health has to do with our emotions and the way we feel, has to do with how we strategize and our decision making, and it has a whole lot to do with the way we relate to one another. But it's not something we often talk about, and we're going to sort of dive into why we don't talk about it as often as maybe we should a little later in the presentation. Another way to think about mental health is a spectrum, okay? So on one side of the spectrum, we have mental wellness, when things are going pretty well, and on the other side of the spectrum, we have mental illness, when things are not going well, when maybe you may or may not be experiencing some sort of symptom related to what you're going through. And all of us are on this mental health spectrum at all times in our life. All right, now maybe that alone makes you feel a little uneasy. Again, I'm going to ask you just to stay open-minded and bear with me. Each of us experiences symptoms of mental wellness and symptoms of mental illness throughout our timeline, throughout our lives. And many of the symptoms we may or may not experience are due in part to the trauma or the pain that we've experienced in our life, in part to where we live and who raised us and what's going on in our family at home, in part to what stress we may or may not be under at work or otherwise. All of these things play a role into how we feel and how we think and how we relate. So we're all on this mental health spectrum. One side is mental illness, one side is mental wellness. And I want to dive into both of those sides of the spectrum real quick. Start with the positives, okay? I'm pretty optimistic. I like starting with a positive thing. So what is mental wellness? Some of you may remember this diagram from back in the day when you were taking Psych 101 in college or maybe in high school. This is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, Maslow was a psychologist in the late 50s and early 60s in the United States that popularized the belief that our needs as a species build upon one another, okay? So the most basic needs we have as human beings are what we call physiological needs. This would include anything you need to survive, like food, water, shelter, rest. Those are things we absolutely need to survive. You won't be able to keep being a human without getting the things in this category. And to build on that, if you don't have those things, you will not feel safe. Okay, so we already see how this starts to build on itself. We won't feel safe if we don't have food. You don't feel safe if you don't have water. You don't feel safe if you don't have shelter. You might think about the homeless population, for example, who faces scarcities in some of these physiological resources. They're not feeling safe, which makes it more difficult to achieve some of the needs in the higher categories here. Now let's say, like most of us who are tuning in tonight, we do have our physiological needs met. We're pretty well off, maybe middle class. We have a nice home. We have food on the table. We're not worried about those physiological needs. That would provide that most of us do indeed feel safe. But safety has more to do with your perception of safety than it does with actual safety. For example, I am in your church building right now. It feels like a pretty safe room, But if I were to look out this beautiful stained glass window over here and I notice that it's thundering and lightning outside and I start hearing really, really heavy wind and then I hear the tornado sirens go off, suddenly I do not perceive this big open building with all of these sharp music stands around me as safe anymore. It might be literally safe, but I no longer perceive it as safe. So safety has as much to do with your perception of safety. If you feel safe, then you have the opportunity to think about the next category, which is love and belonging. Love and belonging has to do with those people in your life that you feel most safe with. You see how these things are connected bottom to top, right? Those we feel safe with, we want to belong to, and we want them to belong to us. We need these close relationships in order to be full, in order to experience true mental wellness. Without trusted, loving relationships in our life, we will experience a deficit both emotionally and physically. There's science to back this up, and I'd be happy to shoot you some of those resources if you want to see some of those studies. It's really quite fascinating. But if you don't feel like you have those intimate relationships that you can lean on, that support network, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to think about the top two tiers, which have a lot to do with internal, self-related reflection. All right, if you don't have a loving family that you belong to, you may struggle with self-esteem, the way you feel about yourself, or any feelings of accomplishment in your life. You may not even have the opportunity to feel that because you're worried about trying to build these intimate relationships if you don't have them. But let's say, like most of us, we do have a few intimate relationships that do provide us with some meaning and some love and belonging. That provides us the opportunity to think more about what is my purpose? What is my self-esteem? What do I think about myself? Am I okay as a person? It leads to some of these more deeper, more philosophical questions, if you will. And the top of the tier is self-actualization. And this is simply a realization of your full potential. Okay? But if you do not have these other categories, your self-actualization will not be possible. True mental wellness requires us to have some or all of these needs met. But as you've each experienced in your own lives, there are going to be times where you don't have these needs met, or at least not all at once. Meaning, on this spectrum of mental health, there are going to be times where we spend more time on the mental ill side of the spectrum, where we experience some really serious trauma, really serious pain, really serious big emotions that are overwhelming. What I want to start by saying is that it's okay to feel those things. It does not mean you have a diagnosed mental illness, but what it does mean is that those with diagnosed mental illnesses are just like you. And I think that's really, really important, especially as we start talking about stigma later in the presentation. So this is the good side, mental wellness, having these needs met, but the other side of the spectrum is mental illness, okay? Mental illness is simply when some of these needs are not met and you feel symptoms as it relates to those needs not being met, okay? That might be a slightly different definition than what you've been given before, but my goal here is to open up this conversation so that everyone feels included and can see themselves in this, as opposed to leaving it sort of shrouded in darkness and pushed under the table or kept in a closet like it has been for so long, especially in communities of faith, especially in the United States. So mental illness is not just this big scary thing that's hard to talk about. It's something we can define. It is when my needs or your needs are not being met and I am experiencing some sort of change, symptomatic change possibly, as a result of those needs not being met. Now, if we talk about diagnosed mental illness, that's when some of these symptoms make it more difficult for you to walk through your daily life as you would normally. That's when it would become diagnosable. So for example, if you're experiencing really deep sadness, maybe it's as it relates to losing a loved one, which is very relevant for a lot of folks in the United States right now, and that deep sadness is making it hard for you to get out of bed, and it's causing you to cry multiple times a day, sort of unexpectedly, and you no longer look forward to things like meals or break times at work. It's just kind of like everything starts to feel gray and monotonous. Those are symptoms, very classical symptoms of depression. Depression that can be diagnosed and treated and helped, which we'll talk about. But you can also just feel sad, and that's completely normal, right? It's all part of this one big mental health spectrum, okay? But let's talk a little bit about those that could be diagnosed, because I think it's important that we show some compassion to this side of the spectrum and see ourselves in this. This is just a small list of bullet points of some of the most commonly diagnosed mental illnesses. You'll recognize a few, like anxiety disorders, like depression, like we already talked about. There's a few on here that maybe you're less familiar with, like dissociative identity disorders, as well as schizophrenia. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something we oftentimes hear related to being in combat, but it's not just for veterans. Like, a lot of folks experience PTSD for a variety of traumas, and we'll talk a little bit more about trauma here in a moment. You've probably heard of at least one of these, right? Maybe you've experienced at least one of these. Maybe you have a friend or family member who's experienced the symptoms of one of these diseases. What I want to communicate in showing you this list is that all of us have the potential to experience them, and all of us have the potential to heal from them, okay? None of these things are death sentences. None of these things are untreatable. This is a hopeful conversation. And I think that's a really important first foot forward to put. I want to show you some data now, okay? Now, this is the portion of my presentation that's going to be a little bit more of a yawn factor. I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I'm a public health guy by degree. I graduated from Purdue in 2015 with my degree in public health. And public health folks really, really love data because data shows us facts, and facts can help us change culture and change our minds about things. So I'm going to show you some facts about mental illness specifically and the impact that it has in the United States. And I don't have my glasses on right now, so I'm going to have to stand a little bit closer to the screen, but you all can read this just fine. So I'm going to buzz through this data, and then we'll sort of decompress after that with some more relevant things. So right now in the United States, 1 in 5 adults will experience some sort of diagnosed mental illness, or at least the symptoms of that. 1 in 5. That equals right under 44 million people in the United States. So right off the bat, it's important to realize if you experience this, you are not alone. You are not alone. Many, many people experience symptoms of mental illness in the United States every single day. About 1 in 25 adults in America live with a serious mental illness. Now, that key phrase, live with, simply differentiates between the acute or short-term experience and the chronic or long-term experience of a mental illness. So 1 in 25 adults live with their symptoms every single day and are probably getting some treatment for that, or maybe they aren't. Either way, it affects their daily life for a long time. Sometimes on this mental health spectrum, you might experience something painful or something dramatic or traumatic and experience the symptoms of mental illness for a week or two, and then it goes away. That's okay. It affects everybody differently, but some of us are living with it every single day. About 1/2 of all chronic, again, long-term mental illness is beginning by the age of 14. And 3/4 of it begins by the age of 24, meaning most of us have experienced some of these mental illness symptoms before we even graduated high school. All right, so think about the young people in your life. Think about some of the hardships they're facing this year, especially in regards to how COVID is affecting our school and education system. They're probably going through some trauma, right? They're probably experiencing some of these symptoms of stress, maybe in a much more exaggerated way than they have in the past because of this added hardship that they're under. So it's important to realize that it starts early, but it's not always diagnosed early. Let's focus in on those young folks for just a moment, okay, and see if there's any parallels with the adult statistics. About 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a mental illness this year. All right, so that's basically the same as adults, 1 in 5. 1/5 of kids in the U.S. will experience symptoms. About 20% of them are living with it, okay, that's that long-term chronic. All right, 11% of youth have some sort of mood disorder. Mood would include things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, things that directly affect the feelings and the emotions. 10% of youth have a behavior or conduct disorder. This would include things like addiction, for example. And then about 8% of youth have a specifically anxiety-related disorder. And anxiety is on the rise. Again, we talked about how right now, just in the U.S., it's kind of ambient. All of us are feeling really anxious, but diagnosed anxiety disorders are also on the rise and have been for the past 15 years in our young people in the United States. So let's talk about treatment. Are people getting the help they need? Well, the short answer is some, which is kind of a bummer. I wish I could say everybody's getting the help they need, but not everybody is, and there's a variety of barriers to getting the help that you need, which we'll talk about in the context of this presentation. About 60% of adults with a mental illness did not receive any sort of mental health services last year. Okay, so that's well over half of the people who are experiencing symptoms of mental illness are not getting the help they need. And again, we'll explore why in a moment. When you look at kids, it's similar. It's about 50% of kids with diagnosable mental illness are not getting diagnosed and getting the help that they need. And then this last graph is particularly important and, again, very relevant. This is one of those graphs that may well make you a little bit uncomfortable, but it's important we talk about it. This stratifies those who are getting help and those who aren't getting help by race. And what we see here is that those who are not white, okay, are much less likely to get the help they need. So the Black and Latino communities are much less likely to get the help they need when they experience mental illness than white communities are. Why do you think that is? We have to say the word. It's because of racism. It's because of the racist structure of some of our healthcare systems, as well as some of the racist stigma that exists to asking for help as a person of color. We would be neglectful if we didn't at least acknowledge that in the context of this presentation. But for now, let's move on. What impact is people not getting help having on our economy and on our society? The first thing to note is that about 10.2 million people who are experiencing mental illness are also experiencing addiction. Why do you think this is? Well, all of us have different coping skills and coping mechanisms for the stress or the pain that we're experiencing. Some of those coping mechanisms are very healthy, things like exercise, talking to a loved one, having a good hobby or outlet for creativity. Some of those are unhealthy, like drinking, like smoking, like taking substances that are illicit. And those of us who are using substances to cope with the stress we're feeling are much more susceptible to developing full-on diseases of addiction, substance use disorders, as we would call them in the field. About 26% of those who are currently without a home, those who are part of the homeless population, are also experiencing mental illness right now. 26%. That's a quarter. A quarter. So think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right? We talked about how those who are homeless don't have their most basic physiological needs met. So you might ask yourself, is it that lack of needs being met the cause of their mental illness, or is the mental illness the cause of losing their job, losing their home, and becoming homeless? It's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of conversation. But it's important that we ask these questions, especially as we consider, as people of faith, how we can help, right? How do we help those who are experiencing homelessness and mental illness at the same time? It's very important to talk about. About 24% of the state prisoners in in Indiana are experiencing a mental illness. A quarter of the people in prison right now are experiencing a mental illness. You know what this means? And this is going to be impactful when you hear it. This means that our state prison system is the #1 mental health service provider in Indiana. Think about that. Is a prison the best place to receive treatment for mental illness? The short answer is absolutely not. It is not. However, many of those who are experiencing mental illnesses are simply thrown into prison because their behaviors are very, very harmful to others and themselves. And this is important that we realize it's a direct pipeline, and it's something that can be prevented and can be interrupted, especially as we look at both the healthcare system and the justice system. A few more statistics. We're almost done, I promise, okay? About 50% of all lifetime cases start by the age of 14, but usually it takes about 10 years before someone will finally get into treatment of some sort, whether that's medication-assisted treatment, whether that's counseling or therapy, whether that's some sort of group program. 10 years of experiencing symptoms before someone finally feels like they are able or finally has the barriers removed to get the treatment they need. That's a really long time. About 37% of students with a mental health condition age 14 or older will drop out of high school. That's the highest dropout rate of any disability group. And about 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have a mental illness. So it's even higher in the juvenile justice system than it is in just the adult justice system. The adult justice system is 24%, but in juvenile it's 70%. Just take that into consideration, right? Kids experiencing traumatic, harmful things in their life who are experiencing then, because of that trauma, the symptoms related to whatever mental illness might be triggered are going to jail, juvie jail, instead of getting the help they need. This is a problem in America, and it's something that I think we as people of faith can play a role in alleviating and fixing. All right, this is my least favorite slide, but again, we'd be neglectful if we didn't talk about it. This is one of those uncomfortable slides. In the United States, suicide is the third leading cause of death for 18 to 24-year-olds. Okay, I'm sorry, for 10 to 24-year-olds. I misread that slide. And about 90% of those who die by suicide have an underlying mental illness. The vast majority of those who are harming themselves have experienced symptoms of mental illness. But it's a little bit worse when you look at just our state. In Indiana, it's the second leading cause of death. Okay, so think about the top leading causes of death in the state. All right, we have like car accidents is pretty high up there. We have more medical things like heart disease and cancers and things that's pretty high up there. All right, but neither of those things is totally preventable. However, suicide is completely preventable, and yet it's the second leading cause of death for our young people in Indiana. That's a problem, right? That's a problem. One more slide that's, again, we've been neglectful we didn't talk about. Youth, in particular, who identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community are 3 times more likely to contemplate suicide and 5 times more likely to attempt it. All right? Now, you can draw your own conclusions about what that means, but how I would see this as a public health professional is those who are experiencing higher amounts of discrimination for a variety of reasons are much more likely to hurt themselves than those who are not experiencing higher levels of discrimination. So, finally we've arrived to this big word we keep throwing around, trauma. Trauma is the main reason why mental illness exists. All right? Trauma can come in a variety of forms. This is just a short list, but I would guarantee most of you tuning in have experienced at least one thing on this list, right? We have divorce. If your parents are divorced, that is a trauma that you experienced as a child. Moving or transitions from homes or communities or between schools, that can be really traumatic for kids. Being abused, whether that's sexually or physically or emotionally. Experiencing grief or loss of a loved one. Having a parent or caregiver who suffers from addiction or a mental illness. Any sort of violent incident, whether that was like a fight or a shooting or like a car accident or some sort of natural disaster. Experiencing racism or discrimination. All of these are different types of trauma that human beings will go through at some point in their life. And we all react differently to this trauma, okay, on the long-term scale. But deep down in our brains, we all react the same way. There's this one mechanism in our brain that we're going to explore here in just a moment. I kind of geek out about this. If you have any brain science nerds tuning in, you're going to love the next few slides here. So there's this part of our brain called the amygdala. All right, the amygdala is kind of located in the center of the brain. If you want a quick little diagram, an easy way to keep track of this, if you think of your hand as your brain, okay, like a fist, all right, and you open up your fingers and you open up your thumb, the palm is sort of the cortex, the very center of the brain, and inside there is the amygdala, all right, and the thumb's going to represent the amygdala. Near the amygdala is also the hypothalamus, okay, and then wrapped around those central parts of the brain is our prefrontal cortex, okay, and that's your fingers. Your prefrontal cortex is what you use for like judgment and feeling and emotions and whatnot. But below, inside, deep down in the ancient parts of our brain, this amygdala, hypothalamus, this central cortex area, that's what's in charge of our reaction to things that are scary. That's what's in charge of breathing and our heartbeat and hunger, like the sort of basic things that are required to keep us as an organism alive. Excuse me. So when you experience something potentially dangerous or scary or potentially painful, the amygdala triggers what's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. Maybe some of you might remember this from school. But the fight, flight, or freeze response has everything to do with this little hormone called cortisol. Okay? The amygdala triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline, if you're more familiar with that. They're very similar hormones. And it gets dumped into your brain and bloodstream, and it causes these very intense physical and mental reactions to whatever stress you're about to encounter. Okay, that would include things like your heart racing, your eyes dilating, your blood vessels kind of constricting to push the blood faster through your body. All of these things happen. You start to tense up, might feel a little sweaty or clammy. All of these things happen as part of this response, triggered by that deep ancient part of our brains, okay? This is like what kept cavemen alive when they were hunting, big predators, for example. Like it's the same part of the brain that's been part of human beings throughout our history. And you'll respond typically one of 3 ways when this trigger happens in your brain. Some of us will prepare to fight back, okay? Maybe you know immediately this is you because you're ready for a fist fight, or like you're ready to push back on something, or you're ready to like wrestle something into submission that might be harming you or scaring you. But those of us who might be less physically powerful might try to run. Maybe we're pretty quick. Maybe we run away from whatever is causing us pain or trauma. A lot of us, though, especially those of us who are younger, who might not have the dexterity to run away or the strength to fight back, simply freeze like a deer in the headlights. right? That's what's happening when a deer is standing in the middle of the road and you honk at it and it's just staring there, frozen. It's having a fight, flight, or freeze response. It's the same mechanism in their brain that is triggered in ours when we're about to get hurt. Let me give you an example to illustrate this point just a little bit further, okay? I want you to imagine with me that we are in high school again, okay? And we're on a spring break trip with our senior class. We're down in Gatlinburg in the Smoky Mountains. And we're hiking a big long trail on the mountain, and we come around the bend, and we see some rustling in the bushes up ahead, and out onto the trail comes bounding this big mama black bear, okay? And she looks like she's a little bit agitated. And then behind us, we hear the little pip squeals of a little baby black bear about 100 yards back. It seems like mama has been separated from baby, and mama is angry about that. And between mama and baby is our little group on our hike. How many of you tuning in, just imagining that, start to feel your heart just pick up just a little bit? You start thinking about, man, what would I do in this situation? How am I going to get out of this? Right? Let's twist the metaphor a little bit, though, okay? Just to really drive this point home. Let's say we get home from our trip, all right, and we're putting our stuff away, and we're taking a shower, getting ready for bed, and when we get into our bedroom, the black bear is there. All right, that's wild. Now you might giggle at this, but bear with me, okay? Let's say that black bear then starts to thrash us around and hurt us, all right? And then it closes the door and locks it, and it continues to hurt us, and we can't get away from that black bear. And let's say the next night when we get home from school, that black bear is still there and comes into our room again and locks the door again. And let's say the next night, and the next night, and the next night, the black bear is still there, ready to hurt you. All right, this would be a classic metaphor for like familial abuse, right? Abuse from someone who's very trusted, like a parent or a sibling or an aunt and uncle. This happens to people all the time. And when you experience that kind of trauma over and over and over again, this brain response continues to happen, but that cortisol and adrenaline just kind of stays in your body and bloodstream instead of being consumed the way it should be, right? With some sort of, grand physical action. It just kind of stays there and it becomes toxic. This is where the phrase toxic stress comes from. And toxic stress or toxic trauma is stored in the body as long-term memory. Okay, our bodies remember the pain we're experiencing, especially chronic pain, forever. It never forgets it. Now, you might not remember it here, but your body remembers it forever. All right, and it teaches your brain different triggers to try to avoid experiencing that pain again. We'll talk about triggers in just a moment. Okay? The brain is naturally self-defensive. Okay? It's going to try to keep the organism alive at all costs. It's going to protect itself from pain. That's what this fight, flight, or freeze trauma response is. It's self-protective. It's trying to get you out of or prevent the experience of danger or harm. Okay? But when you experience it over and over and over with chronic stress, toxic stress, or chronic abuse, or any sort of trauma like that, it can become very toxic and lead to negatively impactful symptoms, things like dissociation and cutting. So maybe you've heard of self-harm, cutting, or hitting one's head, or some people have like sort of picking tics and things like that that are very harmful to their physical body. That is actually the brain trying to control the pain it's experiencing. In other words, out here has become so hard and so uncontrollable that in order to gain some control back over the organism, the only way to feel in control again is to cause its own pain. Right? That's what the brain is trying to do. It's really, really harmful. Or dissociation is another interesting example. So in many cases of childhood sexual abuse, you'll see as an adult that child will have multiple different identities or personalities. Essentially what the brain has done is provided a new reality for that child to live in that's less harmful than the one that's being abused. Okay, and if consistently your brain is producing new realities for you to live inside, but consistently you keep getting abused, you'll end up with multiple different realities. Right? And that's where we get things like dissociative identity disorder or personality disorders. Okay, it's actually the brain's way of trying to protect itself. So this word that I just used, triggers, sometimes you might have heard this, or maybe you've heard your kids say it, oh man, I'm so triggered by that. It's become kind of a slang term, but before it was a slang term, it was actually a psychology term. Triggers are your brain's way of reminding your body of how to avoid past trauma. And it can be anything. Okay, a trigger could be a color. The color red, for example, if maybe you were hurt or hit by someone who was wearing a red shirt. It can be the scent, like the scent of a perfume or cologne, if you were ever hurt by someone wearing a certain cologne. It can be a location. So, for example, My wife experiences anxiety on a regular basis, and back before she was diagnosed, she experienced it on her way to her workplace at that time. And now every time that we pass that exit on I-65 South, she tenses up a little bit. Her body remembers that going to that particular work location was harmful for her. It was harmful to her mental health. So our bodies will teach us these triggers to try and avoid those things from happening again. And I think one way that we as people of faith and as community members and neighbors can be more compassionate to one another is learning and talking about our triggers in order to help avoid them, in order to help prevent causing people further trauma when we don't need to. Ultimately, when someone is triggered by some sort of traumatic experience, they're led to feel isolated. And one of the main reasons we feel isolated when we are experiencing trauma or when we are experiencing the symptoms as they relate to trauma is because we don't necessarily know how to talk about it, or maybe we don't feel like we have someone who is safe to talk about it to. Okay, this has to do with a few of the barriers to getting the help we need, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But what you need to know is that isolation is the single greatest risk factor for self-harm and suicide. In fact, it's the single greatest predictor of self-harm and suicide, according to the public health data that goes into this presentation. That means that if you perceive that you are alone, not even just physically being alone, like I'm basically alone in this room other than two others, but that's not the same. If I feel like I'm alone, even if I'm in a crowded room, that is isolation. It's being alone in here and in here. And that kind of isolation can be really harmful to your mental health, especially if you're already experiencing negative symptoms. So how do we get past this isolation? How do we prevent it? I think we have to discuss what barriers people are experiencing to getting the help they need and figure out ways together to overcome those barriers, okay? So there are three main barriers, all right? The first one is stigma. The second is the cost of mental health care. And the third is a lack of provider availability. Now, we're not going to dive into the second two very much just because we can't save the world in a single night. I'm sorry, that's not in my job description. Can't be a savior. We already have one of those. However, it's important to realize that it does cost a lot of money to go to therapy if you don't have insurance. So consider all of the many, many hundreds and thousands of individuals in the state of Indiana who don't have insurance. Maybe they're working part-time, or maybe their employer does not provide that benefit. It's much more difficult to get mental health care without insurance. There's also not that many providers available. So in the state of Indiana, and even more specifically in Hendricks County, where Pittsboro lies, the ratio of mental health providers to citizens is 81 providers per 100,000 citizens. Let me repeat that. There's 81 mental health providers per 100,000 citizens in Hendricks County. That is not enough, so that is a barrier to getting the help you need. But the one I really want to dive into together, because it's the one that we have the most control over, is stigma, okay? So what is stigma? Stigma has a lot to do with the words we say, with the way we kind of judge each other and look at each other and act around each other, and the way our media talks and treats and exhibits mental illness. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples of each of these. Okay, number one, the words we use can be like hand grenades. Okay, they can be like hand grenades. They can be explosive and hurtful to people without us even intending them to be so. How many of you have said something like this? Oh my word, my friend is so crazy. He's just a maniac. I mean, his sense of humor is ridiculous. He's so physically comedic. He is bonkers. He's crazy. All right, those words can be really, really stigmatizing if you don't know who's in the room. All right? Many of those who've experienced more severe mental illness have been called those things derogatorily. Right? That person's crazy. They can't get out of the bed. They must be crazy. They have multiple personalities. They must be a maniac, right? These are not kind words to use, and we use them flippantly all the time. Or here's another, maybe more common example. Last night, when I got into bed, I saw a spider crawl across my dresser and then disappear. It disappeared. I'm totally going to have PTSD because of that. I have PTSD because I lost that spider in my bedroom. Oh my gosh. All right, for real though? You have PTSD? Okay, maybe if you're like super arachnophobic, but how would the friend who just got done serving in Iraq feel about that comment, right? Or how would your friend who was sexually assaulted feel about you using PTSD so flippantly? They probably wouldn't take to it too kindly. The words we say are very impactful, and they can hurt people if we're not careful. So that causes a lot of stigma in our society. Another point of stigma is just sort of this attitude of judginess that, if we're all being honest with ourselves, we do practice. Okay, this is an example to really humble ourselves right now. Think about the last time you were in Indianapolis or Chicago, downtown, okay? Maybe you're doing some shopping at the mall or whatever, or going to a fancy restaurant, and you're walking on the sidewalk after you parked your car, and you see a member of the homeless population, and this person is just screaming obscenities. They're yelling at everybody who walks by. They're clearly not having a good time. They're upset, and they're acting symptomatically. All right, how many of us were just like really, really into the idea of walking up to that person and asking if they're okay? Yeah. Well, I don't see any hands in the room because there's nobody here, but I guarantee you're not raising your hand at home either, right? Most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are like, I think I'm just going to go to the other side of the street now and avoid that altogether, right? Because we're uncomfortable with it, right? Symptomatic behavior of mental illness can be really hard to understand. It can be potentially offensive, potentially harmful, and we don't get it, and we'd rather just like, no thanks, just avoid it. But do you think those individuals don't know that? You know, they don't know or don't feel any sort of way when they see people exiting the sidewalk to the other side of the street to avoid them? It can be really harmful for them. It can be really isolating. And remember, isolation is the number one predictor for self-harm and suicide. Right? We all practice this. Or maybe you have that one friend who you think is just like a little bit needy. They're frequently texting you and asking you questions about this or that. Like, hey, how do you feel about this? Or, I had this conversation. I don't really know how to feel about it, and I feel really overwhelmed. Like, what do you think about it? And they're texting you every day. Like, maybe they are experiencing some hardships, but you're just like, ugh, I can't stand being around this person. They're so exhausting. Oh my gosh, another problem. Something else is going wrong in their life. Enough is enough. Like, I'm not their therapist. Right? How many of you have that friend? Maybe you think of anybody, or maybe a family member right now comes to mind. Do you think that person doesn't pick up on the fact that we're annoyed by them? Do you think that individual doesn't pick up on the fact that we'd rather not spend time? Or maybe we're spending a few more hours before we text them back? They notice. We notice. Speaking from experience, we do notice, and it hurts, and it can be isolating. That's what stigma is. The last example of stigma is our media. So maybe some of you have seen this movie, Split. Okay, I'm going to use this as a specific example because it's more recent. This came out about 2 years ago, and the plot of the movie is that this individual, his name is Kevin, has multiple personality disorder. Okay, he was abused as a child, we learn in the movie, very severely, and his brain, trying to protect him, developed multiple realities for him to live inside. But throughout the movie, we start hearing about this 24th identity that's about to emerge called the Beast. And the other personalities of Kevin are talking about this beast who can change his own physiology and bulk him up in the muscles, and how he can scale walls like an alien, and how he can flip cars over with superhuman strength, and how he's going to hurt people and beat people to death and eat them. And it's horrifying stuff. All right? Do you think that's actually what DID, dissociative identity disorder, is like? How do you think people who actually have DID and are living with the symptoms of that every day feel about this representation of them? Because now, in the United States of America, that's the only example you might have of DID, is the Beast. Is that fair? Is that true? No. It's stigmatizing. I mean, how many horror movies are set in an insane asylum that's been abandoned? Right? Just think about this. It's all over our media. It's so stigmatizing. Sidebar, insane asylums don't exist anymore. Those were outlawed in the 40s and 50s, right? We have hospitals now that do a really good job of providing treatment for those who need it, but I digress. We need to be aware of these things and how we can destigmatize. The first way we do that is by changing our vocabulary. Instead of flippantly using words that we don't know the meaning of, or that we do know the meaning of but just don't care to use, we should be more careful. Just give a second more thought before you make a joke about someone's trauma. Give a second more thought before you use words like crazy or maniacal, or a second more thought before you respond harshly to someone who has a need or might be annoying to you because they're reaching out to you. We need to change our vocabulary to be more compassionate. We need to speak about mental illness as it is. It's an illness, right? And it's part of this mental health spectrum that we've been talking about that all of us may experience at some point in our life. But here's the hopeful thing about speaking about it as an illness. Illnesses can be what? Treated, right? Illnesses can be treated. Treatment does exist. There is hope in this conversation for those who are experiencing symptoms of mental illness. But talking about it like this big, dark, scary thing, or worse yet, not talking about it at all because we're just nervous, right? That is so stigmatizing and it isolates people, right? Lastly, we need to spread the word and share more openly about our own experiences, right? When it comes to, in particular, males in the United States, we are oftentimes taught to conceal our feelings and push them down and not talk about them with each other and not share openly about what sort of pain we might be experiencing or how we might have some nerves about this or that. And that ultimately just adds to the problem. It does not help us get through the problem. It does not help us find healing. It does not help those of us who are experiencing more severe symptoms get the help that we need and deserve. So we need to share more openly. What this boils down to is the practice of empathy, which as people of faith, we should be relatively familiar with as long as we are following through with those tenets of our faith. Empathy simply means putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It does not mean that you understand, okay? Let me be clear about that. You should not tell someone who is experiencing a trauma that you've not experienced that you totally understand what they're going through, because you do not. Empathy simply means that you're trying to see and feel things from their perspective. That's it. I empathize with the pain you're experiencing. I empathize with the symptoms you're experiencing as a result of this or that that's happening in your life. Empathy is something I think all of us need for our own good, and I think it's something all of us can practice for each other's good. Empathy is the opposite of isolation. Connecting with each other emotionally is the opposite of isolation, and that's so, so important. Okay? So how do you help? All right, this is sort of like the last 10 minutes or so of our presentation. We'll be monitoring the time to make sure that you all have the opportunity to ask questions. We're almost right on the money. Okay? How do you help? Number 1, listen. Number 2, be present. 3, affirm a person's identity. And 4, refer to professional help. Let me just run through this real briefly. Listening means sitting face-to-face with someone, or maybe video screen to someone in our current pandemic. It does not mean sitting next to them while scrolling on your phone. It does not mean just texting someone. All right? It means actual human face-to-face interaction. Listen to them and be present with them. Listening does not mean forcing someone to share something they don't want to share. Listening does not mean that you do all the talking. Right? Listening means being with someone, being present, and simply letting them be. Experience what you're experiencing. Share your emotions with me if you feel like. Tell me more. I'm here to listen. I might not have the solution, but I'm here to listen. That's so important. Affirming someone's identity means simply to remember that someone experiencing symptoms of mental illness is not their mental illness, right? You are not your depression. You are not your anxiety. You are not the hardship that you're experiencing, right? You are Chase. You are Betsy. You are John. Like, we need to affirm each other's personhood, right? You are experiencing things as a person, but you are not that thing that you're experiencing. And lastly, refer to professional help. There's loads of professional help available that we need to be more comfortable talking about, okay? I'm going to pause here for questions before I do the last few slides, okay? This is a resource, this slide here, that I wanted to share with you all just so you are aware of what the symptoms of like a more severe case of a mental illness would be in case you might be experiencing or a loved one. It's important that we're aware of that. But before I move on to that and go into a few more resources, are there any questions in the chat box? All right, no questions at the moment. If you do have any, please feel free to enter them. Or if you end up watching this after the fact, please email them to Pastor William, and he can email those to me, and I will be happy to send some responses back or even connect you with some local resources that you might be able to learn more about in regards to those questions. For now, let's move on, and sort of the last 10 minutes or so, I'll ask one more time about 5 till 8 if you have any more questions. So some warning signs of mental illness. Okay, I'm going to step up here again because I don't have my glasses on. Feeling very sad or withdrawn for more than 2 weeks at a time, crying regularly, fatigue. Of course, trying to harm or kill oneself or even making plans or talking about doing so. Any sort of out-of-control risk-taking behaviors. Sudden overwhelming fear for no reason, like that fight, flight, or freeze response that's happening too often. Not eating, throwing up, using laxatives, lose weight or control your eating or gain weight. Severe mood swings that cause problems in relationships. Repeated use of drugs or alcohol. Drastic changes in behavior or personality or sleeping habits, waking up too early, feeling agitated. extreme difficulty concentrating at work or school, intense worries or fears that get in the way of your daily activities. That's the key phrase there. These symptoms are getting in the way of my daily activities. They're making it harder for me to just simply be. If you're experiencing any of these symptoms, or if you have a loved one, a friend, or a family member who's experiencing any of these symptoms, please hear me right now. And if you didn't hear anything else in this presentation, just hear this. There is no shame in asking for help. That's worth repeating. There is no shame in asking for help, especially professional help, because it is available. When it comes to someone who's expressing suicidal thoughts, it's very important that we take it seriously. Suicide and self-harm absolutely is not a joke. People don't make jokes about this. Even if they might say something jokingly, there's a good chance that that person is experiencing self-harming thoughts. So the best thing you can do for a loved one who's experiencing this is ask very direct, very specific questions. And that might make you feel uncomfortable, but this is evidence-based. Okay? They've literally done scientific research of suicide survivors and asked them, what was the thing that prevented you from completing the act? And they said, when someone asked me, are you considering hurting yourself? Right? It's a really basic question, but it's direct. And chances are, if that person is experiencing those sorts of thoughts, they'll say, actually, yeah, how'd you know? Right? They'll be taken aback. They might be opening up to you in that place. If they answer yes to this question, it's important to ask the next question, do you have a plan, or do you have a means of carrying out that plan? Right? Because these two questions are going to indicate whether or not you're in an emergency. Okay? Many people live with regular suicidal thoughts, believe it or not. It doesn't mean they're ready to kill themselves all the time, but it does mean that they have self-harming, critical thoughts of themselves often. All right, so it's important to ask these follow-up questions. Do you have a plan, or do you have the means of carrying out that plan to know whether or not this is an emergency that needs to have intervention right now? If the answer is yes to these, you have permission in the state of Indiana to call 911 and to get that friend some help. Okay? If they don't want you to do that, or if you're worried about causing a scene, which in my own opinion, it's better to cause a scene and save a life than to not, invite them over to your safe place. Okay? Whether that's going and picking them up in your car, just sitting with them, and again, being present and listening, right? Not offering solutions, just being present and listening. That is the solution. Whether that's inviting them to come to your house, and having them stay the night with you, like whatever you can do to get them in your presence, and that way you know they're safe, that's what's going to prevent self-harm in an emergent situation, okay? Professional care. There's that statement I just said again. There's no shame in needing and asking for professional help. There are a variety of professional helps available, including cognitive behavioral therapy, psychological counseling, psychiatric intervention, medically assisted treatment. Some of us are just biochemically predisposed to experience some symptoms of mental illness. Some of us have way too much serotonin in our brains. It's not our fault, it's just kind of a matter of genetics, and we can balance those things out to help alleviate the symptoms of depression, right? I believe, at least in my own faith tradition, that all good and perfect gifts come from above, and medicine is one of those good and perfect gifts, right? Many of us use medicines and vitamins for other ailments that we're experiencing, but we don't stigmatize them the way we do those who are taking medicine for their mental health, right? But there are other medicines that could be stigmatized that we just don't, like, for example, diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes is something that a lot of folks get because of poor eating habits or lack of exercise, etc. But we don't stigmatize them or prevent them from getting the help they need or shame them for needing insulin, right? But when it comes to things like depression and anxiety, we oftentimes do shame people for needing the medicine that can help with that. I would encourage you to think about medicine differently. Think about it as a gift that we can utilize for our health and for each other's health. I also believe that counselors and therapists are the closest thing to angels we're going to get this side of the kingdom. They are some of the most empowering and loving individuals, and they are trained oftentimes, most times, at a master's level to provide you with both personal and interrelational strategies to cope with the pain or the trauma or the emotional hardship that you might be experiencing. And you might not have access to those strategies otherwise, right? Those things they learn and they practice and they utilize to help people all the time. Speaking from experience, it works. One technique that I learned when I was in therapy for depression was mindfulness techniques, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay? A couple of resources real quick that I want you to make sure that you save these things. Number one is the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or the National Lifeline. It's 1-800-273-8255, or 1-800-273-TALK. Okay, you can call this number 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and talk to a professional who can connect you with local resources or walk you through a crisis. Sometimes there's a waiting line on this, though, believe it or not. And so there's another resource that I would encourage you to check out called the Crisis Text Line. Very similar, but a little bit more accessible, especially if you're not sure you can talk on the phone right now, or maybe it's a younger person who's in a crisis. You can text anything to 741-741, and a licensed person will respond to you and connect you to local resources and give you best practice advice on how to get through that crisis situation. So those are two great resources to be aware of. Okay? This link right here is a link to every mental health provider in Hendricks County and the surrounding counties. Okay? It doesn't have all of them from Indianapolis, but the closer to the west side of Indianapolis, closer to us here in Pittsburgh, this link has all of them listed, including insurance information, including website links, phone numbers, addresses, what types of things their counselors will treat. It's all in one place. Okay, so I would encourage you to bookmark this link. This can save somebody's life. Okay, it's all in one place. Some other online resources include To Write Love on Her Arms, which is a really neat nonprofit. They sell apparel, and with the profits and the proceeds of that apparel, they raise money to help people get into therapy who might be suicidal. The National Alliance on Mental Illness is a great organization that provides statistics and education programs throughout the U.S. related to mental health. Mental Health America is very similar to NAMI. And then lastly, the Trevor Project is LGBTQ plus focused for individuals who are looking for resources from that community in regards to their mental health. The last thing to talk about here before I close, okay, is self-care. The best thing you can do to prevent mental illness and to make sure that you're ready to help someone who is experiencing symptoms of mental illness is to take care of yourself. Right? You might have heard of the oxygen mask metaphor, where on a plane that's experiencing some sort of trouble, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first before your buddy or your kid, right? Same thing applies to mental health. We have to take care of ourselves. So I'd encourage you tonight, after you're done watching, reflect. How do you cope with stress? What coping mechanisms or skills or lack thereof do you have? And be honest, right? Maybe make a column of healthy coping mechanisms and a column of unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? Maybe your go-to is a beer after work. Like, okay, maybe that's not a problem yet, but that's a gateway to a bigger problem if that's your number one way of de-stressing, right? Or maybe you haven't exercised in a long time, but there's a lot of good public health data that shows that exercise is a great way to help boost our mental health, right? So that we feel more mentally well. Ask yourself, do I have any symptoms, right? Remember that list, those warning signs. Am I experiencing anything like that? Do I need to ask for help? Am I taking myself seriously enough, right? Ask yourself, do I have a community? Right? Are there people in the church, or are there people in my neighborhood or in my family that I trust, that are safe to talk to about what I'm experiencing? These are very, very good questions to ask yourself on a regular basis as part of self-care. And lastly, just because of my own experience in therapy, I wanted to introduce you briefly to mindfulness practices, okay? Typically when I give this presentation, I would lead everybody through a guided meditation. I won't do that since you're all at home, and it'd be kind of weird just me doing it on a stage. But there are a few different mindfulness practices, things like deep belly breathing, body scan meditations, loving kindness meditations. Prayer is a form of meditation, okay? That counts. It does. Prayer and devotion time is a form of meditation. All right, mindfulness simply means becoming more mindful of the present moment and how my body feels in this present moment. Okay, it's a way of getting more in touch with aches and pains, both emotionally and physically, and how you can release some of those tensions and release some of those emotions in a healthy way. There's a whole bunch of great meditation resources recorded on YouTube or on Spotify, and you're welcome to go check those out. Some of them are more like Eastern spiritual stuff. Some of it is more psychology, because the psychology community in the U.S. has very much adopted some of those things and done some research about it and how to do it in a way that is actually great as a treatment tool. And it's worked for me. I practice a body scan and mantra meditation for about 5 to 10 minutes before I walk into work every single day, just to calm myself down, get in touch with my body, get in touch with my emotions, see if there's anything I need to let out or talk to God about. And it's a great way just to help care for yourself, especially during these trying times. If there are, again, any questions in the chat box for now?
Just one. Patricia asks, how do we convince someone of their self-worth? And she went on to say that this person has an anxiety disorder and constantly says things like, I am ugly and no one likes me.
Oof. Okay, so Patricia asked, how do you convince someone of their self-worth? Patricia has a loved one who seems to have some negative self-talk behavior, saying things to herself like, I'm ugly, nobody likes me. That is a great question, Patricia. Thank you for being open-hearted enough to ask that question. I'll preface my response by saying I can only speak from experience. I cannot speak from a clinical level because I'm not a trained counselor. But from my own experience, working with those loved ones in my life who have self-esteem issues, the number one thing you can do is talk to them positively. Now that might sound too simple, but we don't often say things like, I love you, right? We might think we do because we feel them in here, right, and in here, but we don't often say things like, I love you, right? I think you are a beautiful person, both inside and outside. And being even more specific with our praise, I think this part of you is beautiful. I think this component of your character is admirable. Being specific with our praise and boosting each other up and just owning some of the awkwardness that comes with paying each other compliments can be a really, really powerful tool for those who are experiencing negative self-talk. But furthermore, since Patricia, you indicated that this person already has a diagnosed anxiety disorder, I would encourage you just to take it very seriously when she says these things and know that she actually believes that, okay? This is not just symptomatic, right? That's a belief system. That's a worldview that she has about herself that very well might need professional strategies to help cope and alleviate. So please be the friend with a loved one that says, you know, I don't think that about you. And I believe that maybe you don't have to think that about you either if you get some professional help to work through those thoughts, right? Be the friend of the loved one that normalizes getting professional help, that says, you know what, it's okay to have thoughts like that, but it's not okay to have thoughts like that forever. And there's help that exists. So thanks for that question, Patricia. Any other questions?
Where's the line between getting help for depression? I think many of us are experiencing forms of depression right now, mainly due to isolation.
Uh-huh.
So how do I personally know when do I need help and when am I okay? Is it just self-harm, or is there other modes of knowing when I can't take care of it by myself?
That's a great question. So Pastor William asked, what is sort of like the threshold, the line of knowing that I'm experiencing what would classically be defined as depression, right? Because many of us are experiencing, again, this sort of ambient anxiety and a lot of grief and sadness just with the loss of normalcy that we're all going through together. How do I know that it's depression and I need help, or is it just, you know, what we're all experiencing? That's a great question. Sort of the three primary symptoms of diagnosable depression, if you will, are fatigue, lack of interest or apathy, and sadness, like prolonged, like unidentifiable or unquantifiable sadness. What I mean by unidentifiable or unquantifiable is like I can't trace a reason for it. I just feel down. I just feel sad. Now here's one interesting caveat that I'd add to that, Pastor. Many men experience sadness the same way they experience anger. Okay, so if you found yourself feeling much more irritable with your spouse or your kids, or if you find yourself just like way on edge all the time at work and just ready to pop off at a moment's notice, that is also a symptom of deep internal sadness or grief, and that can be a symptom of depression, especially in males. Not just males, it can be females too, but especially males in the United States experience anger before they identify it as sadness. When it comes to things like fatigue, it can be just general physical lethargy, like your limbs feel heavy, you feel tense and tight all the time, and you can't get rid of it. You might even have a great difficulty getting out of bed, more than your normal, oh, I'm sleepy, my alarm's going off. Like, no, I don't want to get out of bed today, period. That is true fatigue. And then the apathy is sometimes particularly easy to ignore. Losing interest in your loved ones and how their day is going and interacting with them, losing interest in hobbies that you enjoy, losing interest in your daily work, losing interest in even ways that you would typically rest, those are all symptoms of depression. So I would be on the lookout for those things.
Yeah, and the last thing we have is a lot of thank yous on there just for your presentation. It was helpful to them, so thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And again, if you have any further questions, please email those to Pastor William. I'd be happy to answer those in retrospect and connect you with some resources. I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
All right, Chase, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everyone that joined our live stream tonight. But it's not over. You now have a responsibility to share this information. Not only did you need to hear this, but I'm praying and I'm knowing that God wants you to share this information with others as well. So please make sure to share this with as many as we can. We've got it on the Pittsburgh Chatter already, but we want to make sure it goes out to more people. It's going to be on our Facebook page. We're going to put it on our YouTube page, and it's going to be available as a resource as you go on. We know this is a tough time. I know things are closing down once again. We're feeling that pressure once again, but remember that there are resources like the Willow Center and other places that you are not alone and that you can get through this. So God bless you, and thank you so much for joining us. Have a blessed rest of your evening. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chase.